Welcome to the Hearts of Fishermen podcast. In this series, we are walking through the Gospel of Mark together. Grab a Bible, read the section, and listen as we experience the story of Jesus together. All readings come from the Christian Standard Bible. We hope you enjoy. Welcome back. We're going to begin in Mark chapter 2 and verse 13. We just came off of a really important podcast where we saw why many of these men were willing to leave everything behind and follow Jesus. Jesus could cast out the unclean spirits. He healed the sick. He cleansed the unclean. And we also saw in chapter 2 that he could forgive sins. And so our reading today begins in Mark chapter 2, starting in verse 13. Jesus went out again beside the sea. The whole crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. Then passing by, he saw Levi the son of Alphaeus sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me," and he got up and followed him. While he was reclining at the table in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who were following him. When the scribes who were Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he told them, "It is not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners." There's a bookend of sorts that's happening here. You might remember back in chapter 1, verses 16 through 20, we saw Jesus call Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And those four men were fishermen. They left behind family. They left behind their work to follow Jesus. Here is a bookend where we're told about a tax collector by the name of Levi. Levi ends up becoming the apostle Matthew that we'll read about a little later on. So Levi and Matthew are the same. But I want to spend a little bit of time explaining the work of a tax collector in this day and age. You know, we hear that, and we might think that's an honest wage. But you see, in this day, that wasn't how a tax collector's fellow Jews would have viewed them. The way they would have looked at a tax collector is that he was actually someone who betrayed his own people. Because you see, the Roman government is overseeing the land at this time. They've been taken over by the Roman government. And so if you were a Jew working as a tax collector, you were seen as a traitor. Why would you work for the Roman government? And sometimes a tax collector would lean into that. They would make a lot of money, and so oftentimes they would surround themselves with people who the world just considered sinners, people who are missing the mark on following God. And so on this passage and many others, we actually see tax collectors and sinners grouped together, and you'll see that more consistently as you keep reading the New Testament. But here Jesus is in the house of Levi. It's after he walked up to him just like the others and said, "Follow me," and they're having a meal together in his home. And there are some of these scribes and Pharisees who are appalled that Jesus would even be in this man's house. We'll also take a time out to talk about who these Pharisees are, because they're going to come up quite a bit more in Mark's gospel. The Pharisees were almost like a religious political party, a religious sect within the Jewish community. And they put an emphasis not only the keeping of the Old Testament, but also many of the traditions that the Jewish people had established throughout the centuries prior to Jesus' coming. And the Pharisees were often at odds with Jesus because he didn't do things the way that they did. Namely, here, he was eating with the tax collectors and sinners. And so they're judging Jesus for this. Why would he do such a thing? And when Jesus found out about it, he responds in what is really our first parable in Mark's gospel. It is not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. Do you hear his response? Sometimes we don't relate to it in our modern culture. Sometimes we go to the doctor just for a routine checkup, but in most cultures, that's not how it works. You only go to the doctor if you're sick, not if you're well. And I don't believe Jesus is here calling the Pharisees righteous in the sense of they don't need any of his help. They're self-righteous. They think they have everything figured out. But it's those who are humble. And so in much of Jesus' ministry, watch out for this. Watch how Jesus will go to those who are the outcasts and the poor, those that everyone else regards as sinners. That is who Jesus came to save. He came for us sinners, those of us who have humbled ourselves. Well, This isn't the last time we'll see the Pharisees. In fact, there's some more questions they have for Jesus and the way he's doing things. So we'll move into the next section. Mark chapter 2, verses 18 through 22. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. People came and asked him, "Why did John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus said to them, "The wedding guests cannot fast while the groom is with them, can they? As long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. But the time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, otherwise the new patch pulls away from the old cloth, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost as well as the skins. No, new wine is put into fresh wineskins." There's this question that the disciples of John the Baptizer and the Pharisees have. They're asking about fasting. That might be something you've read about at some point. Typically, we do that for some kind of health trend. That's the way it gets talked about now. Intermittent fasting was a big thing here recently. But this is a fasting that took place for a religious purpose. Often fasting was paired with needing to mourn over the loss of somebody, grief, sometimes even mourning over sin, feeling sorry for what you've done. The Pharisees and John's disciples did this regularly. It was a way to feel religious. It was a way to feel deeply in touch with your spiritual self. And so when they find out that Jesus and his disciples are not doing this, it's almost like they're like, well, is he really religious if he's not fasting like we do? Why don't you fast? Jesus' answer is again with a few simple parables. And the first one is pretty easy to understand. He likens it to a marriage and to the wedding celebration. That on the day that the groom is going to get married, all of his guests are not going to fast on that day. Instead, they're going to rejoice and celebrate. On my wedding day, I had a team of godly men around me that were rejoicing with me that day, my groomsmen, right? And if one of them had come into the room and he was looking all solemn and sad, and I looked at him and said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, I'm fasting today." I would likely say to him, "Well, today's not the day to fast. Today is the day of celebration. I'm getting married today, right?" Jesus is saying the same thing. Today is the day that the groom is here. He is the groom in this analogy. So his disciples are rejoicing because there's going to come a time, he says, that the groom is going to get taken away. And in that day, they will fast. This is really the first allusion in Mark's gospel to Jesus' crucifixion, to Jesus' departure from the earth. His disciples will be sad when he leaves in that way. Then he answers it in another way. He uses two analogies that I think get lost on us sometimes in our culture today. He talks about somebody who shows a piece of cloth onto an old garment. And he points out the fact that whenever you take a new piece of clothing, a new piece of cloth, and you put it on an old garment, what's going to happen whenever you wash it for the first time? Well, that new cloth is going to shrink up, and then it's going to fall off, and there's going to be an even larger hole in your jeans or whatever have you. You see a similar thing with the wineskins. They didn't keep their wine in bottles like many do today, but they had this animal skin that they would keep them in. And whenever the new wine would get poured into those skins, what would happen over time is that the gas in the wine would kind of cause that leather to expand, and that pouch would get larger and larger. But over time, as that wine got poured out, it was no big deal. But when it got emptied, you could no longer use that wineskin, because if you poured new wine into it and it expands and expands and expands even further, eventually it's going to burst and the new wine is going to go everywhere. What is Jesus talking about? What Jesus is talking about is that these Pharisees are not going to be able to cubbyhole Jesus into their old traditions. They're going to try to. In fact, I would suggest much of the text that we're going to be looking at today emphasizes this, that the Pharisees are upset that Jesus is not conforming to what they want him to be. And anytime they try to force Jesus to conform into their old traditions, there's always friction. There's always conflict. We'll pause here because there's an important point to learn from this. As you read through the story of Jesus, There's going to be a temptation to want to force Jesus to be something in your mind that he really is not. And as you keep reading and you're confronted with some things about Jesus you didn't know before that might step on your toes, you will have a choice. You can either force him to try and be what you want him to be in your mind, or you can just let Jesus be who he is and change your thinking to conform to what he says. But if we continue to try to force Jesus to be something he's not, the wineskin will burst. The jeans will tear. There will be a larger hole. We cannot push Jesus to be something that he simply isn't. And ultimately, that is what happens. That's the downfall for Jesus, in the sense that the Pharisees will ultimately have him killed. The Jews will have him killed because he did not conform to what they wanted him to be. We'll move to the next section. Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. On the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and also gave some to his companions." Then he told them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." Okay, so we approach the Sabbath day. We talked about this in a previous episode. The Sabbath day was Saturday. It was the seventh day where the Jews were commanded to rest from their labor. They were not to go out and work the fields. But here on this day, Jesus is in the grain fields with his disciples, picking the heads of grain, just eating a little snack. And the Pharisees see that, and they immediately accuse him of doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath day. They're accusing him of working on the Sabbath day. Take a time out to explain a couple things. Number one, what Jesus is doing is not stealing. Like, if we were driving down the interstate and there was a cornfield and we were hungry, we couldn't just hop off the interstate and take some corn. But in the Old Testament, what they were actually commanded to do with their fields is they were told to leave all of the outer edges of their fields unharvested so that the passerby and the stranger would have something to eat. The passerby was told, though, you couldn't take a sickle, so they couldn't mass harvest what was left behind, just take enough to feed themselves. So this is what Jesus is doing. He's not stealing. But secondly, he's also not working. He's feeding himself. The Sabbath laws never said that you couldn't eat. But the Pharisees are certainly making it out like that. And so the way Jesus reasons with them is quite fascinating. He brings up the story of David. David was a king in the Old Testament. And there were a lot of spiritual highs in David's life that we read about. David and Goliath might be something you've heard about, where David takes on this giant and he ends up slaying him. But what's sometimes forgotten is that there were some real lows in David's life as well. That's what Jesus is citing here. He's actually citing this story from 1 Samuel 20, where David was on the run from King Saul. And whenever he ran away, at one point, he ran up on the temple and he demands for this bread that's in the temple and says, "I need it for myself and my men because we're hungry." But this bread, only the priests were allowed to eat it. And David was not a priest. He wasn't from the right tribe. He was not from the tribe of Levi. And he ends up telling the priest in his desperation, just give it to me. My men have stayed away from women. We're holy men. Just give it to us. We are on the king's mission. But that wasn't the case. He was running away from the king. And so the story goes that the priest gives it to him and David goes on his way. That's the story that Jesus is citing. Some people look at that and say, is Jesus citing situational ethics? Is he saying it's okay for him to break the Sabbath because on this occasion David lied and it was because he was hungry? That's actually not what Jesus is doing at all. In fact, what we have to think through is how the Jewish mind thought of King David. He was the quintessential Jewish king. He was the one they looked up to. And so here Jesus is citing a story where David was clearly in the wrong, and they will not dare throw a stone at the character of David for this. But here is Jesus doing something completely right within the law, and they're accusing him of doing something unlawful. What hypocrisy, what a double standard, what a contradiction. And that's what they're doing. And so Jesus says that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for Sabbath. They've actually completely mixed up what the purpose of the Sabbath is in the first place. The Sabbath day was a day of rest where the Jewish people would reflect on the fact that they used to be slaves and God delivered them. And instead, they've turned it into, we can't do this and we can't do that. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So then the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus knows what the law taught. Well, this isn't the last run-in he has with these Pharisees, especially regarding his actions on a Sabbath day. Let's move right into the next chapter because it has direct relevance to that story we just completed. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a shriveled hand. In order to accuse him, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. He told the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand before us." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts and told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Immediately the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might kill him. Here Jesus, on the Sabbath day, enters into that synagogue. Remember the synagogue, the Jewish church building, if you will? And there is a man there who has a shriveled hand, maybe a regular congregant of the synagogue. But you notice the Pharisees are waiting to see what's going to happen, because they see the man with the shriveled hand, and then they see Jesus standing there, and they're sitting there wondering, oh, I wonder if Jesus is going to heal them. But they're not thinking that out of a sincerity, oh, I hope this happens. It's actually from a little bit darker place. Oh, I hope he does this so I can get him, so we can accuse him, so we can say, aha, see, you do work on the Sabbath day. And so Jesus knows this inner dialogue is happening. And so he makes a little bit of a scene out of this. He tells the man with the shriveled hand, "Come stand before us." And just imagine all the eyes kind of flocking on this situation in the synagogue. And Jesus asks a question that I believe is dripping with sarcasm. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to kill? It's not really a hard question to answer. Surely God would want us to do good and to save a life, even on the Sabbath day. Surely he wouldn't want us to do evil and kill. Should be an easy question to answer, but the text says they remain silent. I think they're getting the point. So naturally, Jesus looks around at anger with them, grieved at the hardness of their hearts. He's floored that they can't even answer this simple of a question. And so notice the way he does this miracle. He just tells the man to stretch out his hand. And so the man does, and immediately it is restored. I want you to think about that. Many of the miracles we've witnessed Jesus do, he lays hands on people like he did with the leper at the end of chapter 1. With this man, he doesn't even touch him. He does no work, per se. All he has to say is reach out your hand, stretch out your hand, and it's restored. But in verse 6, they don't rejoice. Instead, they go out and they plot with the Herodians as to how they might kill Jesus. Two things. One, they actually answer that question that Jesus asked back in verse 4. It's still the Sabbath day. Do they think it's better to do evil and kill or to do good and save? But on the Sabbath day, they go out and plot how they might kill Jesus. There's the real answer to Jesus' question. But number two is the Herodians. I want to touch on them. They're yet another political party, if you will, among the Jewish people, followers of Herod, the one in charge of this area at the time of Rome, of the Roman Empire. And so naturally, these two groups of people normally don't like each other. The Pharisees hate the Roman government. The Herodians kind of are in support of it. But as the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they plot how they might kill Jesus. Hang on to those Pharisees and Herodians. We'll hear more from them in later chapters. But we're going to continue our reading today. Let's look at Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea. And a large crowd followed from Galilee, and a large crowd followed from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, beyond the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. The large crowd came to him because they heard about everything he was doing. Then he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him, so that the crowd wouldn't crush him. Since he had healed many, all who had diseases were pressing toward him to touch him. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." And he would strongly warn them not to make him known. Jesus is growing quite the followers at this point. It says a large crowd is following him from Galilee. If you have your Bible, you might be able to look in the back of it and see a map of the Bible lands at this time. And if you just look for some of these place names like Jerusalem, Idumea, Tyre, Sidon, you will see just from the far distances that people were coming to just listen to Jesus. And it gets to be so many people, they have to have this boat ready because people might crush Jesus because they're all trying to touch him. But Jesus is healing many. The unclean spirits are falling down, crying out, "You are the Son of God." And he tells them not to make him known. Again, we mentioned this in chapter 1. He does this because it's not good PR to have the demons running around saying who you are. So this is one of several summary sections in Mark's gospel of showing us just how many followers Jesus is amassing as he is doing these miracles and doing his ministry in preaching and teaching. Well, let's see what this narrows down to. I'm going to read Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 19. Jesus went up the mountain and summoned those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him, to send them out to preach, and to have authority to drive out demons. He appointed the 12. To Simon he gave the name Peter, and to James the son of Zebedee, and to his brother John he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Jesus is getting quite the amassing of followers, but now he narrows down his apostles, his disciples, the 12, you might have heard them called. And if you've ever wondered what the word apostle means, there's actually a definition within the verse. Within verse 14, he named them apostles to send them out to preach. The word apostle just means sent out person. And they were sent out by Jesus. And their mission is very similar to what Jesus was already doing. Go drive out the demons. They're going to go heal the sick. And it tells us what the names of these 12 men were. Some of them we've already seen, like James and John, the sons of Zebedee. He actually gives them the nickname Sons of Thunder, or Boanerges, quite literally, in Aramaic. And what that word might denote for them is that they were fiery guys. We're not 100% sure why they got that nickname, but Jesus knew. Another noteworthy thing is that we have Simon the Zealot at the end of verse 18. This man was among the Jewish people who hated the Roman government, so much so many of them were assassins and were trying to take out Roman authorities. We mentioned earlier that there was Levi, the tax collector. His name is also Matthew. There he is, a tax collector for the Roman government. So imagine him and Simon the Zealot getting paired up together as apostles. The expectation from Jesus was to drop what they're doing, leave it all behind, and follow him. Put the political differences aside and follow him. How beautiful is that? Let's look at Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 30. Jesus entered a house, and the crowd gathered again so that they were not even able to eat. When his family heard this, they set out to restrain him, because they said, "He's out of his mind." The scribes who had come down from Jerusalem said, "He is possessed by Beelzebul, and he drives out demons by the ruler of the demons." So he summoned them and spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is finished. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Then he can plunder his house. Truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for all sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. because they were saying he has an unclean spirit. Jesus goes into this house, and this crowd gathers, and it's so many people. Jesus has so many people to see to. He doesn't have time to eat. Maybe you've been through a time like that in your life, where life was so busy, you didn't have the time to take care of your basic needs. Well, when Jesus' family hears about this, they think he's going crazy. I mean, to their credit, imagine what it would be like to have this sibling that you grew up with, and then suddenly he's out preaching and teaching in these remote places, and he's doing miracles. He's saying things that you've never heard before. It would be quite startling. And then you find out he's not eating. They think he's out of his mind. That comes back up here in a little bit. But in the meantime, because of the amassing of people, the scribes and the Pharisees, those Jewish parties we were talking about, they were growing quite concerned at these followers that Jesus was gaining. And so it says that they came down from Jerusalem and they started to spread a rumor. And that rumor was that Jesus was possessed by Beelzebul. He drives out demons by the ruler of the demons. I want you to think about this. So they're in Jerusalem. That's pretty far away. Jesus is doing his ministry up in Galilee. So they travel several miles from headquarters, if you will, from Jerusalem to go to Galilee to spread this rumor. But I want you to take your mind back to Jerusalem. Think about the council of men who get together and they start hearing reports of this rogue prophet up in Galilee who is gaining followers because of his ability to cast out demons. And we got to do something about that. Because people are following him. They're not following us anymore. And so imagine you're in that boardroom meeting and somebody says, we cannot deny that he's casting out demons. I mean, it would be foolish to say he's not. Everyone is witnessing him do it. And so somebody says, well, what are we going to do about that? And one person says, well, I have an idea. Let's go spread the rumor that the only reason why he can cast out these demons is because he is a demon. He's actually the ruler of the demons. His name is Beelzebul. And everyone in the room goes, oh, what a great idea. And so they send their messengers up to Galilee and they start spreading this rumor around. This is why Jesus is able to do this. And so Jesus hears this rumor and he gathers the crowds and he says, I want to address this. Just think about it for a second. Why would Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. If Satan is opposing himself and is divided, he cannot stand but is finished. Jesus just points out the flaw in their logic. If he was a demon, why would he want to cast out other demons? Wouldn't he want them to persist? This doesn't make any sense. This play would make no sense whatsoever. Let me just stop here and make a point. Sometimes we hear an argument, and at first we think it makes a lot of sense. But if we'll just think about it for a second, we start to see the flaw in it. Jesus points out from the beginning, this makes no sense. But here's what the other thing Jesus does is he points out in verse 27 that no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Then he can plunder his house. I'm going to ask the question, who is the strong man that Jesus is describing in verse 27? Think about that answer for a second. You know, we want to say Jesus. That would be our first initial impression. Well, Jesus is the strong man. But you know, I actually don't think that's the case. It sounds like to me, Satan is the strong man. And here he is holding people hostage. There are all these demon-possessed people. And Jesus says, before you can go in and get the hostages out, you got to deal with the strong man. And then you can plunder his house. And that is the work of Jesus. He is dealing with Satan. And through the work of the cross, he puts an end to Satan. And all of us who have been held hostage in the meantime by Satan, Jesus can come out and save. And so to respond to this accusation that Jesus is demon-possessed, and that's why he does these miracles, he says in verse 28, truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for all sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. And verse 30 is key, because they were saying he has an unclean spirit. Sometimes people read this and they ask me, oh, if I utter the words, I blaspheme the Holy Spirit, does that mean I'll never be forgiven? Look closely at what's happening here. There are some people who are looking at a clear miracle in the face, something that has been clearly done by God's Holy Spirit. And then they are turning around and ascribing it to the devil. Their hearts are so hardened that they cannot even see the beauty behind God's ability, by Jesus' ability to cast out these demons. And so what Jesus is saying is, as long as someone's heart is so hardened that they can even look a clear miracle in the face and ascribe it to the devil, they'll never have the forgiveness of sins. Their hearts are hardened. And it's because they were saying he has an unclean spirit. So just look for context clues like that. Sometimes it helps you work out those kinds of issues. Let's move on to our last section for this reading today. Mark chapter 3, verse 31. His mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him and told him, "Look, your mother, your brothers, your sisters are outside asking for you." He replied to them, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Looking at those sitting in a circle around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my mother, my brother, and sister." I think this is helpful to connect. Back in verse 21, his family heard that he hadn't eaten, and they thought he was out of his mind. And it sounds like to me, they came to get Jesus. I don't know what they were planning to do with him, but they were looking for him. They were concerned. And it doesn't help his case whenever the crowd tells him, "Look, your family is looking for you. They're here." Jesus says, "Well, who is my family?" But we understand Jesus isn't saying he forgot who his family is. He says he actually has a real, more true family. And it's those who are sitting around him. And in verse 35, it's those who do the will of God. They are his brother, sister, and mother. We can be in the family of Jesus if we will sit around him and learn and seek to do the will of God. And so we end this episode by asking, do you want to be in the family of God? Do you want to be a brother, a sister, a mother of Jesus? If the answer is yes, then you must sit around him. You must listen to him. You must do his will. And so keep reading so that you can hear about Jesus. You can hear what he says, so you know how to do the will of God.
Thanks for listening to the Hearts of Fishermen podcast. If you live in the Fishers, Indiana area and want to do your next Mark reading with me in person, send me a message. Contact info is in the show notes. Have a blessed day and keep listening.